The man nied one fictionalized. The rain that evening didn't fall gently over Las Vegas. It came down in long silver sheets that turned the neon lights into trembling rivers of color, blurring the strip into something dreamlike and distant. Outside the Riviera Club, valet lights shimmered against wet pavement as expensive cars rolled up one after another, their doors opening to laughter, perfume, polished shoes, and people who looked like they belonged exactly where they were. The Riviera was not just another restaurant. It was a place where deals were whispered, careers were born, and reputations were quietly shaped. Every table carried an unspoken rule. If you were inside, you mattered. And if you were outside, you didn't. At exactly 7:42 p.m., a man stepped out of the rain and paused beneath the glowing awning. He wore a dark, slightly worn overcoat. No driver followed him. No assistant rushed ahead. No flash of jewelry caught the light. His hair was neatly combed but flecked with silver. His face calm in a way that suggested long familiarity with crowded rooms and louder storms. Most people passing him gave no second look. To them, he looked like a tired traveler, maybe a businessman who'd missed his moment. Maybe someone who had once been important and no longer was. They did not recognize Dean Martin, not the man whose voice had filled ballrooms and radios, not the man whose laughter had echoed through Hollywood backrooms and late-night stages, not the man whose name quietly sat on the founding documents of the Riviera itself, written there years ago when the building was nothing but a dream, dust and a handshake agreement. Tonight, he was simply an older man in the rain. Inside the club, the dinner rush had already begun. Crystal glasses chimed. A piano murmured softly near the bar. Servers moved between tables with trained smiles and straight backs. At the center of this choreography was Eric Calloway, a 24-year-old waiter whose vest was perfectly pressed and whose patience was wearing thin. Eric had been working double shifts for weeks, watching wealthy guests complain about water temperature and seat angles, while he counted tips that never quite matched the effort. He didn't hate the customers. He hated the feeling of being invisible to them. So when the host called out that another walk-in had arrived, no reservation, Eric's shoulders tightened. Through the glass doors, he saw the man in the dark coat shaking rain from his sleeves. Eric sighed. No reservation. No entourage. No confident stride. Just another face asking for space in a room that was already full. When the doors opened, a faint chill drifted in with the man, carrying the scent of rain and city air. Dean Martin stepped inside quietly, letting the warmth settle around him. He took a moment to look around. The Riviera had changed since its earliest days. The walls were richer now, the lighting more careful. But the heartbeat of the place, the music, the murmur, the sense of possibility was the same. It always had been. He approached the host stand. "Good evening," he said calmly. "One table, if you have it." The host, busy scanning reservations, barely looked up. "Name, Martin," Dean answered. The host flicked through the book, fingers moving fast. Then slower. Then stopping. "I'm not seeing you here." "That's all right," Dean said gently. "I don't mind waiting." Before the host could respond, Eric stepped forward, already annoyed by the growing line behind the man. "We're fully booked tonight," Eric said, his tone polite but edged. "It's a private dining hour. Reservations only." Dean met his eyes, unbothered. "I understand." "I'm not in a hurry." Eric glanced at the coat. The wet cuffs. The lack of confidence he thought he saw. And something unkind rose in him. Not cruelty, but exhaustion mixed with quiet resentment. He had spent his whole shift catering to people who barely noticed him. Now here was someone who didn't even fit the picture of who belonged. "I'm sorry," Eric said, his voice firmer now. "This place is selective. We don't really serve just anyone who walks in off the street." The words hung there longer than he expected. Around them, conversation continued. A glass clinked. Someone laughed too loudly. But something in the air shifted. Dean didn't bristle. He didn't straighten. He didn't announce himself. He only studied the young man in front of him, not with anger, but with the quiet curiosity of someone who had once stood where he now stood, carrying trays, memorizing smiles. Wondering which side of the room he'd end up on, I see, Dean said softly. Eric nodded once, as if to close the matter. There's a diner 2 blocks down. They're usually open. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dean Martin smiled, not the practiced stage smile. Not the one magazines remembered, but a small, private smile, touched with something like memory. Well, said, then I suppose I'll wait right here. Eric frowned. Sir, I just told you. I heard you, Dean replied kindly. But I think I'll wait. He stepped aside. Moving to a quiet space near the wall, raincoat still on, hands folded loosely in front of him, Eric watched him go. Irritation flickering. He didn't know why the man bothered him. He wasn't causing trouble, wasn't raising his voice, wasn't demanding anything, but there was something unsettling about how calmly he stood there, as if the room belonged to him in a way no one else could see. What Eric didn't know, what no one in that lobby knew, was that 3 doors down. In a private upstairs office, the general manager was about to come downstairs with documents in his hand, and at the top of those documents was a name. Dean Martin. The Riviera did not quiet easily. It was a place built on sound, the low orchestra of conversation, the distant piano's gentle persistence, the subtle rhythm of silverware against porcelain. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in the atmosphere shifted. Not silence, but attention. The kind that moves without being announced. The kind that makes people glance up without knowing why. Dean. Martin stood near the wall where framed photographs traced the history of the club. Black and white memories of opening nights, charity galas, ribbon cuttings, long-forgotten celebrations. He studied them with quiet familiarity, his eyes soft, his posture unassuming. He could feel the pulse of the place the way a sailor feels the tide beneath a deck. The Riviera still breathed, still lived, still carried ambition in its walls. But it had also grown sharp around the edges. More polished, less patient. Across the room, Eric continued his work, but the irritation hadn't faded. If anything, it deepened. Every time he passed the wall, he caught sight of the man in the dark coat standing there without complaint, without distraction, without a phone in his hand, not fidgeting, not pleading, not leaving, just waiting. It unsettled him. Eric prided himself on reading people. Tourists looked lost. High rollers carried themselves like gravity bent for them. Performers entered rooms as if stages followed wherever they went. But this man carried none of that, and yet something about him resisted being dismissed. He wasn't small. He wasn't unsure. He wasn't trying to belong. He looked like someone who had already belonged to 2, as many places to worry about whether this one accepted him. When Eric passed again, Dean met his eyes and nodded politely, a simple gesture. Free of accusation, Eric looked away. At that exact moment, the elevator near the back of the restaurant chimed. The general manager, Thomas Reed, stepped out holding a leather folder under his arm. Thomas was not a man who walked casually. His suits were always tailored. His expressions were always measured. He had run the Riviera for 11 years and believed deeply in systems, schedules, and appearances. Tonight, he had been reviewing old financial documents requested by the board historical ownership structures, early partnership agreements, legacy stakes that had to be audited before a major expansion. It was supposed to be routine until he saw the name Dean Martin, not in a news article, not on a photograph. On a contract, original ownership share, silent partner, permanent stakeholder. Thomas had frowned at first, then read again, then slower, then stood and gone to the safe himself, retrieving the original folder, tracing the signature, comparing it to archived scans. There had been no mistake. Dean Martin had not only helped launch the Riviera, he had quietly retained ownership interest through every sale, every rebrand, every decade, which meant, very simply, that one of the men who owned the Riviera could walk into the Riviera tonight and no one would recognize him. Thomas had come downstairs, intending to instruct the host discreetly, to ask if anyone by that name had come in, to prepare a proper welcome. If so, he had not expected what he saw. Near the wall of photographs stood an older man in a rain-darkened coat, gazing at an early image of the building when it had still been surrounded by dirt and scaffolding. The man's face was partially turned, but something about the line of his jaw, the slope of his shoulders, the stillness of him sent a strange recognition through Thomas's chest. He stopped walking. The room did not announce what was happening, but Thomas felt it. The way history sometimes leans forward before it speaks. He took one slow step, then another, and then he saw the man's face fully. The blood drained from Thomas Reed's. For a moment, he forgot the room, forgot the guests, forgot the music. He was no longer a general manager in a thriving restaurant. He was a younger man again, standing in a dusty office with blueprints rolled across a table, listening to a voice that joked easily while talking about foundations, acoustics, dreams. Dean. Thomas whispered before he realized he had spoken. Dean turned. Recognition passed through his eyes, followed by something warmer. "Thomas," he said gently. "It's been a long time." Thomas's hand tightened around the folder. He looked at the coat, the rain-damp sleeves, the place where Dean was standing. Then he looked toward the host's stand, and finally, toward Eric. Something hard entered his expression. Did anyone help you?" Thomas asked. Dean glanced around the lobby, then back at him. "Not yet," he replied calmly. Thomas exhaled once. It was not relief. It was restraint. "Please," he said quietly, "come with me." As Thomas gestured toward the private dining corridor, several nearby guests noticed the shift. The way the general manager's posture had changed, the way his voice had softened, the way he did not offer a menu, but something closer to deference. Eric noticed too. He froze mid-step, tray balanced in his hand. Watching Thomas approach the man he had dismissed, he saw Thomas extend his hand, and he saw the man take it. "What's going on?" a hostess murmured. Beside him, Eric didn't answer, because something in his chest had started to sink. Thomas turned slightly, positioning himself between Dean and the room, lowering his voice. "Sir, I had no idea you were in the city." "If we had known," Dean lifted a hand gently. "You didn't," he said. "That's all right," Thomas swallowed. "Your table is already prepared." Dean smiled faintly. "I don't believe I ever asked for one." Thomas hesitated, and then Dean did something unexpected. He looked past Thomas, directly at Eric. Eric felt the gaze land like a hand on his shoulder. "Actually," Dean said softly, "I think I'd like to sit wherever he thinks I belong." The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. Thomas turned to look at Eric, and in that moment, the entire room, all its laughter, all its clinking glasses, all its soft music felt suddenly, unmistakably like the quiet before a storm. When the name finally spoke and no announcement was made, no glass was tapped, no music was stopped. Yet something in the Riviera shifted so completely that even the piano seemed to lower its voice. Thomas Reed did not escort Dean Martin to the private dining corridor as planned. Instead, after a brief hesitation, he guided him through the main floor. Not toward the best table, not toward the balcony, but slowly, deliberately, past the very guests who had been dining without noticing the man who built the room they sat in. People looked up at first casually, then again, then longer. They noticed the way. Thomas walked half a step behind, not in front. They noticed the way his hand hovered near Dean's elbow, not guiding, but protecting. They noticed the way Dean acknowledged no one, yet somehow seemed to see everyone. And in a place where status was usually worn like perfume, this reversal unsettled the air. Eric stood near the service station, tray forgotten, pulse loud in his ears. He told himself it meant nothing, that Thomas was simply humoring an old acquaintance, that he would seat the man somewhere quiet and the night would continue. But then Thomas stopped walking, and he stopped directly in front of him. Eric straightened instinctively. Sir Thomas didn't respond at first. He looked at Eric the way a man looks at a door he realizes too late he has already closed. "Eric," he said slowly, "this is Dean Martin." The name did not land all at once. It spread, from Thomas's mouth into the air, from the air into nearby tables, from tables into whispers, from whispers into widening eyes. Dean Martin. Someone near the bar laughed under their breath. Assuming it was a joke, someone else gasped. A woman at the nearest table slowly set her glass down as if afraid it might break. Eric felt the words pass through him without meaning, like sound through a wall. He had heard the name, of course. Everyone had records, old films, posters, a voice his grandmother used to hum while cleaning the kitchen. But that name did not belong to men who stood in raincoats by walls. That name belonged to stages, to memory, to legend. Thomas opened the leather folder and held it against his chest. "Dean Martin is not a guest," he said quietly. "Dean Martin is one of the owners of this establishment." The room did not erupt. It inhaled and held it. Eric's mouth opened. No sound came. He looked at Dean, really looked at the calm eyes, the unhurried posture, the faint lines of age that suddenly rearranged themselves into something. Unmistakable recognition shock did not come like lightning. It came like gravity. His stomach sank. His hands went cold. His chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding. He remembered his words. "We don't really serve just anyone who walks in off the street." He remembered the coat, the rain, the way that man had smiled as if he were being offered something kinder than truth. Around them, murmurs multiplied. Phones emerged. A man near the back whispered, "That's really him." Someone else said, "No, it can't be." But then Dean lifted his gaze, and the uncertainty ended. Not because of fame, because of stillness. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice low but carrying. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for what has happened tonight. This should never." Dean raised his hand gently. "No," he said. "It should." The word moved softly, but it cut. Thomas looked at him. Confused, Dean turned back to Eric. The young waiter stood rigid, blood roaring in his ears, the world narrowing to the space between them. He had been yelled at before, insulted, dismissed, but never had. Silence felt this loud. "I don't think you did anything unusual," Dean said calmly. "You did what people often do when they believe a place belongs to a certain kind of person." Eric swallowed. "Sir, I didn't know." "I swear," Dean nodded. "Of course you didn't." The relief that flickered through Eric was brief. Knowing, Dean continued, "is rarely the point." He glanced around the room, then back at Eric. "When I helped open this place," he said, "we didn't have chandeliers. We didn't have private rooms. We didn't have velvet menus. We had folding chairs and cheap wine and singers who worked construction in the morning. People came because they were welcome." The room listened, not like an audience, like witnesses. Somewhere along the way, Dean said, welcoming got replaced with filtering. Eric felt something twist inside him. Dean stepped closer, not into his space, into his understanding. "Tell me," he said gently, "if I hadn't been who I am, would I still deserve to eat here?" Eric's breath caught. The answer rose instinctively, yes. But the truth stood in the way. He lowered his eyes. "I don't know," he said. Dean nodded once. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone's said to me tonight." A long silence followed. Thomas looked as if he might intervene, might rescue the moment with policy or apology, but Dean shook his head slightly. This was not a managerial situation. It was a human one. "I don't need an apology," Dean told Eric. "I need you to remember this feeling. Not because it's painful, but because it's awake." Eric's eyes burned. "I never wanted to make anyone feel small," he said quietly. I get tired of being invisible." The word surprised him. They were not planned. They were true. Dean studied him for a moment longer. Then, something in his expression softened. "No," he said, and in those two words was no. "Performance only recognition. The table not on one expct ID, the Riviera had never felt so still. Not when celebrities walked in. Not when million-dollar deals were signed in private rooms. Not when standing ovations shook the chandeliers. But now, in the space between one breath and the next, an entire room waited on what an old man in a rain-dark coat would do. Thomas Reed stood rigid, prepared to offer the grandest table, the quietest corner, the kind of seating reserved for men whose presence alone was considered an event. 100 eyes tracked every subtle movement. Every server knew the night had slipped beyond routine into something that would be remembered. Dean. Martin did not move toward the balcony. He did not move toward the private hall. He turned slightly and looked at Eric. There's a small table near the service doors, Dean said gently. The one nobody likes because it feels too close to the noise. Eric blinked. Yes, sir. I'd like to sit there, Dean said. A murmur rippled. Thomas hesitated. Sir, we have. Dean smiled faintly. I know what you have. I also know what that table feels like. Thomas closed his mouth. Eric led the way. The path felt impossibly long. Every step echoed in Eric's ears as if he were walking down a hallway made of his own heartbeat. He felt the weight of the room on his back. He felt every whispered recognition, every raised phone, every sudden respect that had not existed 10 minutes earlier, and he hated how much that hurt. They reached the table. Small, simple, 2 chairs. No view. Eric pulled one out. Dean did not sit. Sit, Dean said, nodding toward the opposite chair. Eric froze. Sir, I please, Dean said. Just for a moment. Thomas stiffened. Mr. Martin, our staff isn't permitted to. Dean raised a finger, not in command, but in quiet certainty. He is. Eric sat. The room watched an owner remain standing while a waiter took a seat in something ancient. Rearranged itself in the air. Dean took the chair across from him and folded his hands on the table. Do you know why I came in alone tonight? Dean asked. Eric shook his head. Because I wanted to see who this place serves when it doesn't know who it's serving. Eric's throat tightened. I wasn't testing you, Dean continued. I was listening to what? To the space between policy and instinct, Dean said. To the distance between kindness and convenience. To how a man treats another man when he believes nothing is at stake. Eric lowered his eyes. I failed. Dean studied him. No, he said. You arrived. Eric looked up confused. Failure hides, Dean said. Arrival stays. Glanced around the restaurant at the chandeliers, the linen, the slow, careful movements of servers who now understood they were being seen. Places don't drift, Dean said quietly. People drift, and places follow. Back. Eric's hands clenched on his knees. My father washed dishes, he said suddenly. He worked nights. Came home smelling like grease. I used to be embarrassed when he'd come to my school in his uniform. Dean's eyes softened. One day, Eric continued, a man in a suit refused to sit at his counter. Said he didn't want someone like that serving his food. I watched my dad wipe the counter again anyway. And smile. His voice broke. I told myself I'd never let anyone look down on me like that. Dean nodded slowly. So you learned to look first. Eric closed his eyes. Dean leaned back slightly. Dignity isn't something you protect by withholding it, he said. It's something you practice by extending it. He sat in silence, not empty, working. Then Dean stood. I'm not going to reprimand you, he said. I'm not going to fire you. And I'm not going to pretend this was nothing. He placed a hand gently on the table. I'm going to invite you. Eric looked up. To do what? Dean smiled. To help me change something? Thomas inhaled sharply. Dean turned to him. Effective immediately, this restaurant's service philosophy is being rewritten. No guest filtered by appearance. No dignity rationed by assumption. Every person who walks through those doors will be met first as human. The rest can come later. Thomas nodded. Yes, sir. Dean looked back at Eric. And I'd like you to be part of training the staff. Eric stared. Me, you, Dean said. Not because you were wrong. Because you were real. Emotion rose fast, unexpected, unstoppable. I don't deserve that, Eric said. Dean's voice lowered. Neither did the first man who ever gave me a stage. Extended his hand. Eric stood slowly and took it. Applause did not come immediately. It waited then. From somewhere near the back, a single person began to clap, then another, then the room followed. Not loud, not performative, but full. Dean finally sat at the small table, and for the rest of the night. Every seat in the Riviera felt closer to the door.